Carl Jung identified 8 unmistakable signs of an extremely rare personality type. What if the very traits people criticize you for, your sensitivity, your intensity, your depth, your refusal to fit neatly into society, aren't flaws at all, but proof that your mind is operating on a higher level? What if they're not weaknesses, but markers of extraordinary psychological evolution? Jung believed that fewer than 5% of human beings develop what he called differentiated consciousness, a rare way of seeing, feeling, and processing reality that most people never access, a mind wired for depth, for awareness, for truth. And today, we're descending into the deepest layers of Jungian psychology, uncovering 8 powerful signs of rare consciousness that reveal whether your mind operates beyond ordinary perception. But here's the cruel paradox. The deeper you think, the more out of place the world begins to feel. Because society is built for surface living, rewarding speed, conformity, predictability, comfort, and emotional suppression. Most people experience life through collective conditioning, not individual awareness. So when your soul refuses to shrink, life begins to feel like constant misalignment. Jung believed human consciousness naturally resists evolution. It clings to comfort, identity, belonging, safety, because these create the illusion of security. And that is exactly why awakening feels so lonely. Those who possess this rare awareness often feel out of place, misunderstood, too deep for shallow conversations, too aware of comforting illusions, too intense for emotionally numb environments. But Jung saw something radically different, not dysfunctional, evolution. He believed these individuals weren't broken. They were ahead. They weren't malfunctioning. They were upgrading, operating on psychological software the rest of the world hasn't downloaded yet. And if even half of these traits resonate with you, everything about your life is about to finally make sense. Sign number 1, what I call effective consciousness beyond the norm. Jung believed certain individuals possess nervous systems that process emotional information far more deeply than average, granting access to psychological layers most people never reach. These individuals don't simply feel emotions, they inhabit them. Jung described this as affection-toned complexes, emotionally charged psychological structures embedded within the unconscious, not passing feelings, not surface reactions, but living emotional architectures that shape perception, memory, intuition, and awareness. You don't feel in fragments, you feel in dimensions. Emotional waves don't pass through you, they move within you. Your awareness sharpens. It's the signature of a mind built for profound awareness. You sense emotional undercurrents people pretend aren't there. You detect shifts in energy before logic catches up. You hear what isn't being said. You feel what's being hidden beneath politeness. Because your nervous system is tuned for depth, you notice things others overlook. While others skim the surface of life, your mind dives. And Jung understood something modern psychology still struggles to grasp. This is not emotional instability. This is advanced emotional intelligence. When certain psychological experiences become electrically charged with emotion, they imprint themselves deeply into the psyche. So when you feel intensely, you're not overreacting. You're accessing the deeper architecture of the collective psyche, the universal layer of human consciousness beyond personal experience. And slowly you realize you don't belong in shallow spaces. This is why life overwhelms you, not because you're weak, but because you're receiving more data. And while this gives you extraordinary insight, it also carries weight. You become the emotional container for others, until you learn that discernment is survival. Sign number 2. You question reality with what I call transcendent curiosity. You don't accept reality at face value. You interrogate it. Jung described individuals whose psychological architecture operates at a heightened level of awareness, what he called differentiated consciousness, a rare mind capable of observing itself, questioning its impulses, recognizing unconscious motivations, and acting from inner awareness rather than social conditioning. Most people, Jung argued, remain psychologically undifferentiated. They think what they're told to think, want what society tells them to want, fear what culture conditions them to fear. They live inside unconscious emotional scripts, fully identifying with social roles, experiencing life through collective norms instead of individual awareness. But you question everything: relationships, social rules, power structures, traditions, beliefs. Not to rebel, but to understand. You don't just ask what, you compulsively ask why. And when answers feel shallow, your mind digs instinctively deeper. You sense when something doesn't add up. You crave truth, clarity. You want substance. And this unsettles people, because your curiosity dissolves psychological comfort zones. Your questions dismantle comforting illusions. So they label you difficult, complicated, over-analytical, too intense. But Jung saw this as transcendent thinking, the ability to perceive beyond conditioned reality. This trait doesn't make you rebellious. It makes you a truth seeker in a world addicted to illusion. Sign number 3. You've developed what I call radical psychological independence. At some point, you realized something most never do. Depending on external validation is emotional quicksand. So instead of sinking, you built something stronger, an internal foundation. Jung called this process individuation, the lifelong journey of becoming psychologically whole. But this path demands confrontation with the shadow, the parts of yourself buried beneath fear, pain, trauma, and emotional truth most people avoid. So most never complete it. But you did. Adversity forced you inward, and inside you discovered resilience. You became emotionally self-sufficient. You learned to sit with your thoughts, to understand your emotions. You learned to stand alone, not out of isolation, but out of necessity. Solitude stopped feeling like loneliness and became a sanctuary. Slowly, an unshakable sense of self formed, not fragile. A self-worth that isn't borrowed, an identity that isn't dependent, a psychological sovereignty that does not collapse when approval disappears. And that is why your independence runs deeper than most. Sign number 4. You possess what I call emotional hyperperception and deep empathy. Jung believed active imagination was one of the highest functions of consciousness, a bridge between the conscious and unconscious mind. Not fantasy or daydreaming, but the ability to consciously dialogue with the unconscious. Jung revolutionized psychology by formally identifying intuition as a fundamental psychological function. Jung believed the unconscious mind processes vast quantities of information, subtle emotional shifts, environmental micro-signals, symbolic patterns, psychological undercurrents. Through it, intuition emerges, and then delivers them to awareness. Most people live on the surface of reality, reacting to external events, social expectations, and conditioned beliefs. But you perceive beneath it. You read micro-expressions, subtle shifts in tone, tiny changes in energy, energetic changes. You don't simply observe behavior. You read psychological patterns. You feel tension before words reveal it, danger before logic explains it. You feel when something is off, when a smile is forced, when sadness hides behind humor, when anger is swallowed. Your intuition functions as psychological radar. This gives you deep empathy. But it also makes emotional boundaries essential, because without them, you absorb emotional pain that isn't yours, and emotional absorption leads to exhaustion. So discernment becomes survival. Sign number 5. Your purpose. Driven by what I call existential awareness and meaning obsession. You are psychologically incapable of living inauthentically. Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And your soul took that personally, because meaning matters more to you than applause. You can't chase hollow success. You can't maintain shallow relationships. You can't live scripted lives. You cannot live a meaningless life. You've tried, but something always felt wrong, empty, disconnected, because your psyche rejects inauthenticity. When you try to live small, anxiety rises, restlessness surfaces, emptiness expands, not as punishment, but as a correction. Jung believed neurotic symptoms are not disorders, but psychological signals, messages from the unconscious demanding conscious alignment. When your life no longer reflects your inner truth, your psyche rebels. Manifest through anxiety, through dissatisfaction, through emotional unrest, not to harm you, but to wake you. And until your life aligns with your soul, your psyche will never let you rest. Sign number 6. Cycles of psychological death and rebirth. Jung wrote, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents." Because unconsciously, parents pass down their unrealized dreams, their suppressed desires, their unfulfilled ambitions, their emotional wounds, and children inherit psychological expectations that were never truly theirs. But at some point, something inside you began to break free. You started shedding lives that weren't yours to live, identities that were never truly yours to wear, dreams that didn't belong to your soul. And this initiated a pattern that would repeat again and again. You outgrow. You outgrow identities. You outgrow relationships. You outgrow environments. Not because you're cold, not because you're detached, but because growth demands expansion, and expansion changes everything. Jung called this process psychological death and rebirth, a dismantling of old identity structures, a collapse of outdated belief systems, a disintegration of who you used to be, until your previous self can no longer contain who you're becoming. And each time this happens, your world rearranges. People who once felt familiar begin to feel distant. Places that once felt safe begin to feel restrictive. Conversations that once satisfied now feel empty. Not because you think you're better, but because you are no longer the same. You shed outdated versions of yourself. And that shedding is painful, because others often want the old you back, the quieter you, the more agreeable you, the smaller you. But psychological evolution is irreversible. Once awareness expands, it cannot shrink. And that is why this process feels lonely. You don't leave people behind. You simply outgrow the containers that once held you. And each rebirth carries grief for who you were, for who others needed you to be, for the life you can no longer return to. But this cycle is not lost. It is initiation, a repeated death of limitation, a repeated birth of consciousness. And those who walk this path do not evolve once. They evolve many times. Sign number 7. You create what I call a transformational presence. By now, something subtle but undeniable has happened. Your presence alone has begun to change rooms. You don't force insight. You don't push growth. You don't rush healing. Yet wherever you go, transformation follows. People feel seen with you, not because you analyze them, but because you listen beneath their words. You hear what they can't yet say. You feel what they haven't admitted to themselves. You hold emotional space without judgment, without urgency, without agenda. Jung described this psychological reality through the concept of temenos, a protected inner space where transformation can safely occur. A psychological sanctuary, a container strong enough to hold unconscious material as it rises. And without realizing it, you became that container. This is why people open up to you unexpectedly, why strangers tell you their deepest truths, why others feel calmer just being near you. Your presence feels stabilizing, grounding, safe. But Jung warned that this gift carries danger. Without discernment, rare personalities become emotional vessels, absorbing pain that was never theirs to carry. You give more than you receive. You hold others together while slowly emptying yourself. So discernment becomes essential. Not withdrawal, not hardness, but boundaries with consciousness. Because transformation is sacred, and not everyone deserves access to your inner world. Sign number 8. You possess what I call individuated identity and psychological wholeness. Beneath everything you've lived, you've always sensed it. A quiet pull, a knowing without language, a feeling that your life is moving toward something that hasn't fully revealed itself yet. Not ambition, not recognition, not status, purpose. Jung believed this inner pressure was evidence of the psyche moving toward wholeness, the soul pushing itself toward expression. This is the final stage of individuation, not perfection, not superiority. Integration. You no longer reject your sensitivity. You don't fear your intensity. You don't fight your depth. You integrate it. Light and shadow, strength and vulnerability, empathy and boundaries, awareness and humility. Because Jung warned that without shadow integration, rare minds fall into traps. Feeling superior, becoming saviors, burning out trying to rescue others, mistaking suffering for destiny. But true power is balance. You stop trying to be understood. You stop trying to fit in. You stop trying to shrink. You begin to embody who you are. And with that embodiment comes responsibility. Not to lead through authority, but through example. To model depth in a world addicted to surface reality. To hold the truth without forcing it. To live consciously without needing permission. You were never meant to blend in. You were never meant to live quietly. You were never meant to numb yourself to belong. You were meant to lead forward. To question what others accept. To feel what others suppress. To imagine what others fear. You're not too intense. You're tuned higher. You're not too sensitive. You're perceptive beyond the ordinary. And you're not broken. You're not late. You're early. The final awakening. If this journey felt uncomfortably familiar, if parts of it felt like someone was reading your inner life back to you, that wasn't a coincidence. It was recognition. Because rare minds don't stumble onto this material by accident. They find it when they're ready to remember who they are. You were never meant to live on the surface, never meant to numb yourself to belong, never meant to silence your depth to make others comfortable. The loneliness you felt was not rejection. It was an initiation. Without shadow integration, rare minds fall into dangerous traps. The confusion wasn't a failure. It was a transformation. The intensity wasn't dysfunctional. It was perception operating beyond the ordinary. Signals of psychological awakening. Jung understood this long before the world had language for it. He knew that consciousness evolves unevenly, that some awaken earlier, deeper, and more painfully than others. It unfolds in stages. and only a small number of people ever complete the full journey. Not because they're superior, but because they're tasked with seeing first. Your sensitivity wasn't a flaw. It was your instrument. Your questioning wasn't defiance. It was discernment. Your isolation wasn't punishment. It was the space required for individuation. And every time life forces you inward, it was carving something unbreakable inside you. You were being shaped. So if you've ever felt too deep for shallow conversations, too aware for comforting illusions, too intense for emotionally numb environments, understand this: you were never broken. You were becoming. And becoming is never comfortable. The world doesn't need more noise. It needs more depth. It doesn't need more certainty. It needs more consciousness. And it doesn't need more followers. It needs integrated minds. People willing to feel deeply, think honestly, and live consciously. So don't shrink. Don't numb. Don't apologize for the way you're wired. You're not here to blend in. Jung believed individuals like you are essential, not for maintaining the world as it is, but for moving humanity's psychological evolution forward. And that evolution follows a hidden pattern. A pattern Jung observed again and again in rare minds. The 3 stages of psychological awakening. The natural evolution of consciousness. Jung believed there are 3 major stages in the evolution of the psyche: the outsider, the awakening, the individuated. These stages have nothing to do with intelligence, nothing to do with success, nothing to do with status. They describe the maturation of consciousness itself. They explain why some people feel painfully out of place, why some people experience emotional collapse, and why a few emerge with extraordinary clarity, depth, and inner authority. And here's the haunting truth: most people never leave the first stage. Not because they can't, but because awakening demands pain, and wholeness demands responsibility. So let's begin where nearly all rare minds begin. Stage 1. The outsider, the unconscious separation. From early on, you sensed it. You were different, not better, not superior, just not the same. You felt like you were watching life from just outside the room, as if everyone else received instructions you never got. You tried to belong. You tried to adapt. You tried to mirror. But something always felt off. You experienced emotional depth others couldn't relate to. Thoughts that went deeper than normal conversations allowed. A quiet internal complexity you couldn't explain. Loneliness, even when surrounded by people. You weren't depressed. You weren't broken. You were unconsciously awakening. Jung believed some individuals are born with a predisposition toward individuation. Their psyche is wired for depth before society is ready for them. So you hovered at the edge of collective identity, close enough to function, too different to disappear inside it. And until this difference is understood, it creates a subtle pain. You don't know why you feel separate. You only know that you do. This is the unconscious outsider. And here's what most people never realize. If you stay here too long, life will force movement. And that movement is rarely gentle. Stage 2. The awakening. Awakening almost never begins peacefully. It arrives through collapse, a heartbreak, a betrayal, a loss, a burnout, a depressing episode, a crisis. Something shatters the identity you were using to survive. The person you thought you were no longer fits. And suddenly, you are forced inward. You begin asking questions that won't leave you alone. Who am I really? Why am I here? What actually matters? What have I been living for? Jung called this the confrontation with the unconscious, psychological death before rebirth. you encounter. Repressed emotions, buried pain, hidden fears, shadow aspects. Truth you avoided. Your psyche knows you have work to do, and that work requires courage. Your old self begins to dissolve. This stage is agonizing, because the ego is losing control, and the soul is demanding authenticity. You feel raw, exposed, disoriented. But beneath the suffering, something extraordinary is happening. Your consciousness is expanding. This is where identity begins to form, not borrowed, but earned. This is where awareness replaces autopilot. This is where the psyche says, no more pretending, no more shrinking, no more unconscious living. This is the moment you stop surviving and begin becoming. Stage 3. Individuation, psychological wholeness. Very few people reach this stage, not because it's impossible, but because it demands discipline, humility, and responsibility. This is where the shadow is integrated, where emotional regulation stabilizes, where identity coheres, where inner authority replaces social approval. Here you no longer chase validation. You no longer fear rejection. You no longer seek belonging because you become it. You live from internal truth. You respond instead of react. You choose rather than comply with society norms. You trust yourself. You hold emotional depth without drowning in it. This is psychological sovereignty. Jung called this individuation, the realization of the true self. Not perfection, but wholeness. Why this path is so rare. Jung believed most people avoid awakening because pain reveals the truth. Truth demands responsibility. Responsibility requires courage. Most choose comfort over consciousness. But those who walk this path, they become bridges between unconsciousness and awareness. They carry emotional intelligence the world desperately needs. They live not just for survival, but for meaning. And if even part of this journey resonated with you, you are not broken. You are awakening. And once that begins, there is no going back. If you're ready to stop apologizing for the very traits that make you rare, and finally embrace the psychological depth that makes you different, leave a comment below. Not for validation, but as a declaration. Because psychological rarity isn't arrogance. It's my responsibility. And if this spoke to you, share it with someone who's forgotten who they are. Someone who's been told they're too much in a world that survives on too little. Subscribe, not for notifications, but for understanding. Because this journey has only just begun. Remember, you were never too much. You were just ahead. The world is simply afraid of depth, and Jung knew that people like you are the ones who expand it. Thank you for walking this path with me. I'll see you in the next layer of awareness.